Nobody in the Wyoming territory had ever beaten Ezekiel Maddox at a day's work, and Etta Barrett arrived in the summer of 1883 with every intention of being the first. The stagecoach from Cheyenne deposited her at the edge of Copper Creek, a small mountain settlement carved out of the pine-thick foothills of the Wind River Range, where the air smelled of resin and cold water and something wild that had no name in any language she had ever studied. Etta stepped down from the coach with a canvas bag thrown over one shoulder and a leather satchel clutched in her free hand, and she tilted her head back to look at the mountains that rose above the town like a congregation of enormous, indifferent giants. She was 24 years old, lean and dark-haired, with brown eyes that had a particular quality of steadiness that men often mistook for coldness and women often recognized as determination. She had come from Kansas, from a failed farm and a father who had died owing more to the bank than the land was worth. She had come to Copper Creek because her father's old friend, a man named Harlan Briggs, had written to say that there was a homestead parcel available along the northern creek bend, and that a woman willing to work could make something of it. What Harlan had neglected to mention was that the only person who had the knowledge, the tools, and the organizational authority over that stretch of mountain land was a man named Ezekiel Maddox. She found out on her first morning. Harlan Briggs was a kind, weathered man in his late 50s who ran the general store in Copper Creek and smelled permanently of pipe tobacco and wood smoke. He had known Etta's father since before the war, and he received her with genuine warmth, setting her up in the small room above his store while she got her bearings. Over breakfast the next morning, he explained the situation with a degree of embarrassment that she found both touching and alarming. "The thing is, Etta," he said, turning his coffee cup in slow circles, "that parcel you want a homestead butts right up against Maddox land. Has for the better part of 12 years. Now the land itself is free and clear for filing, but the water rights for that creek bend, the access road up from the lower valley, and the lean-to shelter that someone started building on the eastern edge, all of that is entangled with what Maddox has done up there." "Entangled how?" Etta asked. "Well, he built the access road. He dug the irrigation channel. He is the one who started the lean-to before he decided he did not need it on that side of his boundary. Technically, legally, the homestead parcel is yours to file on. But practically speaking, if you want to build anything that actually works up there, you are going to need to work alongside Ezekiel Maddox. At minimum, you are going to need his cooperation." Etta was quiet for a moment. Outside the store window, Copper Creek was coming to life in the early morning, a wagon rolling past, a dog barking at something in an alley, the distant ring of a hammer from the direction of the smithy. "Tell me about him," she said. Harlan scratched the back of his neck. "He is about 30 years old, came up here maybe 7 years ago from somewhere in Montana, built his claim from nothing. He runs traplines in winter, keeps cattle in the lower meadow come spring and summer, trades furs and timber with the merchants who come through. He is not unfriendly. He is just," Harlan paused, searching for the right word, "substantial." "Substantial," Etta repeated. "He is a large man with strong opinions about how things should be done, but he has never been dishonest with anybody that I have seen. Go talk to him, Etta. He might surprise you." She filed her homestead claim at the land office that same morning, a small, sun-faded building next to the blacksmith, where a territorial clerk stamped her papers with the kind of bureaucratic indifference that suggested he had seen 100 such filings and expected no more than 40 of them to result in anything lasting. Then she asked Harlan to point her toward the Maddox property. "Follow the creek north," Harlan told her. "When the pines get so thick you can barely see the sky, you are close." She rode a borrowed horse up the mountain trail, climbing through scrub and switchbacks while the creek murmured beside her, cold and fast with snowmelt. The air grew cooler the higher she went and the light changed, filtering through canopies of lodgepole pine and Douglas fir, becoming something green and cathedral and slightly hushed. She smelled wood smoke before she saw the cabin. It was a serious structure. That was the first thing that struck her about it. Not a rough-hewn shack thrown together by someone doing the minimum to survive, but a real, considered building made of notched logs with a sod roof and a stone chimney from which a thread of smoke rose in a perfectly straight line against the still mountain air. There were split-rail fences enclosing a paddock, a proper woodshed stacked floor to rafter with cut timber, a root cellar dug into the hillside behind the cabin, and a kitchen garden that was already producing in the July heat, neat rows of beans and squash, and something leafy that she could not identify from a distance. Beyond the paddock, the meadow rolled downhill in a sweep of tall grass that was thick and green and clearly benefiting from that irrigation channel Harlan had mentioned. A man was splitting wood in the yard. She pulled up her horse and looked at him. He was the most physically powerful person she had ever seen in her life, and she had grown up around farmhands and worked cattle drives with her father. He stood over 6 feet tall, with broad shoulders that strained the fabric of his plain work shirt, sleeves rolled to the elbow to reveal forearms corded with muscle that moved visibly beneath the skin as he swung the axe. His hair was dark brown and a little long, curling at the back of his neck and falling slightly across his forehead when he bent to reset a log on the splitting block. His jaw was square and heavy, with a few days of dark stubble. He moved with the particular economy of a man who had been doing physical work since before he could remember and had learned not to waste a single motion. He split 3 logs before he looked up and noticed her. He straightened and turned, and she saw that his face, though rough with sun and weather, had a directness to it that was not unkind. His eyes were a clear, unusual gray-green that caught the mountain light like still water. "You must be the woman who filed on the Creek Bend parcel," he said. His voice was deep and unhurried. "Etta Barrett," she said, dismounting and leading her horse forward by the reins. "And you are Ezekiel Maddox." "I am." "Then we need to talk." He set the axe head down against the splitting block and rested his hands on the butt of the handle. He was looking at her with an expression that was attentive and calm and not remotely intimidated. Most men, she had noticed, looked at least slightly rattled when a woman walked up to them with business in her eyes. Ezekiel Maddox looked like he was simply waiting to hear what she had to say. She laid it out plainly. She wanted to homestead the parcel. She intended to build a small house and a working farm. She would need access to the road he had built. She would need to draw water from the channel he had dug, or at minimum negotiate rights to draw directly from the creek. She understood that he had started the lean-to on the eastern edge, and she proposed to either buy the materials from him outright or compensate him in labor for his original investment. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment, and then he did something she had not expected. He smiled. It was not a patronizing smile or an amused one. It was something more genuine than either of those, a smile that suggested he found her directness refreshing rather than offensive, that he was, on some fundamental level, pleased by this conversation. "I have been wondering who would eventually file on that parcel," he said. "I thought about filing on it myself a few years back, but I already had more land than I needed." "So you will cooperate," she said. "I will do better than that," he replied. "I will help you build." She had not expected that, and it showed on her face. "You have a problem with help?" he asked, and there was a note of gentle humor in his voice that she could not quite decide whether to be charmed by or suspicious of. "I do not need help," she said carefully. "I need cooperation." He looked at her for a moment with those gray-green eyes. "There is a difference in your mind. There is a significant difference in my mind, yes." He picked up the axe again and gestured with it toward the mountains above them. "It is July. You have got maybe 4 months before the first serious snow. You cannot build a sound structure and put in a proper root cellar and lay up enough provisions for a first winter in 4 months alone. Not in mountain terrain, not if you have never wintered at altitude. I grew up farming in Kansas." "The Wind River Range is not Kansas," he said, not unkindly, but with the flat certainty of someone who had nearly died in a mountain winter and was not inclined to watch someone else make the same mistake. I am not saying you are not capable, Miss Barrett. I am saying the mountain does not negotiate. She looked at him for a long moment. She did not like being told what she could not do. She had been told that her whole life, by bankers and neighbors and well-meaning men who thought the kindest thing they could offer a woman was a warning. But there was something in the way Ezekiel Maddox said it that was different from all those other warnings. He was not trying to diminish her. He was simply telling the truth, and he had the calluses and the knowledge and the 12 years of mountain winters in his bones to back it up. I will think about it, she said. While you are thinking about it, he replied, turning back to his wood, you are welcome to look at the Linta structure on the eastern edge. It is yours to do with as you see fit. The materials cost me about $8 and 2 weeks of work. We can settle that however seems fair to you. She remounted her horse. She was almost back down the trail when she heard him split another log, the clean crack of it carrying through the mountain air, and she thought, against her better judgment, that she could see why Harlan had called him substantial. She spent 2 days examining the parcel on her own. She walked every inch of it, measuring distances and noting the angles of the sun, testing the soil with her fingers, tracing the irrigation channel to understand where it drew from and where it fed. She was good at this. Her father had taught her to read land before she could read books, and she could see in the topography of the Creek Bend parcel the bones of something that could genuinely work. A house site on the gentle rise above the flood line, a kitchen garden in the south-facing pocket that got the best light, a proper root cellar dug into the north-facing slope where the ground stayed cold, pasture below, woodlot above. She could also see that Ezekiel Maddox was right about the timeline. She went back on the 3rd day. He was mending a fence in the paddock when she arrived, and he looked up without apparent surprise, as though he had been expecting her to return at roughly this time, which annoyed her slightly. I have conditions, she said. Tell me, he said, and straightened to face her, resting one massive forearm on the top rail of the fence. We work as equals, she said. I make decisions about my own land. You advise, I listen, and then I decide. You do not take over. Agreed. I keep track of every hour you put in on my parcel, and I compensate you in fair trade. If I cannot pay in cash, I pay in labor on your land. That is not necessary, he said. It is necessary to me, she said firmly. He held her gaze for a moment and then nodded. Agreed. And you do not treat me like I am going to break. Something shifted in his expression at that. Something that moved like a shadow of old knowledge across those gray-green eyes. I would not dream of it, he said, and so it began. The summer of 1883 in the Wyoming Territory was a thing of brutal, magnificent heat in the lower valleys and crystalline cold at altitude, when the sun went behind the peaks. Etta had never worked in terrain like it, and she would not have admitted this to anyone for any amount of money. But every single morning when she arrived at the parcel after the 40-minute ride up from Copper Creek, she was slightly afraid of it. Afraid of the scale and the silence and the particular indifference of the mountains to human endeavor. She got to work before Ezekiel every single morning. She made a point of it. She would arrive at first light with her tools and her plans and her determination, and she would have already made measurable progress by the time she heard him coming up the trail, his big roan horse navigating the switchbacks with the easy confidence of an animal that knew this route by heart. He would arrive. He would look at what she had done. He would smile, not with condescension, not with that infuriating masculine amusement that said a woman playing at man's work was a thing to be indulged. It was a different kind of smile, quieter and more private, as though something in the sight of her already at work, already dusty and purposeful and absolutely refusing to yield, was something he found genuinely fine, something that lit a small, warm light in him that he was not trying to hide. She told herself it did not mean anything. She told herself she had work to do. They began with the house foundation. Ezekiel taught her how to read the frost line in mountain soil, how deep the footings needed to go to survive a Wyoming winter without heaving, how to square a foundation using nothing but a piece of rope knotted at precise intervals. She learned fast. She had always learned fast, and she could tell by the quality of his attention, steady and genuinely focused rather than performatively patient, that he had noticed this. They moved heavy stones from the creek bed for the foundation walls, and Etta matched him stone for stone, not because she could carry what he carried, because she was not foolish enough to pretend that a man built like a mountain himself did not have a physical advantage in raw lifting, but because she could work steadily and intelligently, and she refused to stop before he did. He never stopped before she did. She would work until her hands were bleeding and her back was screaming, and she would look up and find him still going, smooth and unhurried, like something geological in its patience. He would catch her looking, and he would say nothing, but the corner of his mouth would lift in that quiet smile that was becoming, against her every intention, one of the more significant features of her daily landscape. "You are going to hurt yourself," he said one afternoon in the second week of August, not looking up from the wall he was setting. "I am fine," she said, flexing the hand that had a blister the size of a silver dollar on the heel of her palm. "You have a blister on that hand that is going to split," he said, still without looking up. "How do you know that?" she demanded. "Because I watched you transfer your grip to the left side of the handle 40 minutes ago." She stared at the back of his head. He kept working. She wrapped her hand with a strip of cloth and kept working. That evening, as the light dropped behind the western peaks and turned the sky above the Wind River Range into a spectacle of amber and deep rose, they sat at opposite ends of the Linta structure that Etta had commandeered as her temporary shelter while the house was being built, and they ate from the provisions she had brought in her saddlebag. She had made cornbread that morning at Harlan's store. Ezekiel had brought dried venison and cold beans. They ate without much conversation, the way people who have spent a long day doing hard work together sometimes eat, with the easy silence of shared exhaustion. "Why did you come here?" he asked, and it was so unexpected that she looked up from her cornbread sharply. "I told you to homestead the parcel." "I know why you came to the parcel," he said. "I mean why here, Wyoming, mountain territory." "You have the look of someone who was aiming somewhere specific." She was quiet for a moment, deciding how much to say. "My father died in the spring," she said finally. "He owed the bank everything we had. When it was settled, I had my clothes, my tools, and about $30. Kansas was full of people who knew what that meant and felt sorry about it. I did not want people to feel sorry for me." He looked at her steadily. "That makes sense," he said. He did not offer her anything beyond that. No condolences, no reassurances, no well-meaning suggestions about what she should really do with her life. And she was so grateful for it that she felt something loosen behind her breastbone. "What about you?" she asked, and then immediately felt foolish, because she had set a rule for herself about not asking him personal questions on the grounds that it made things too friendly. But he answered. "I grew up in a mining camp in Montana," he said. "My father was a miner. He died in a collapse when I was 14. I did various work after that, trapping, cattle drives, logging. When I was 23, I came up into this range and I decided I was done moving." "Do you ever regret it?" she asked. "Not once," he said, and looked at the mountains above them in the fading light with an expression that was purely uncomplicated love. And Etta thought that whatever else Ezekiel Maddox was, he was a man who knew exactly where he belonged. She wished she knew that about herself. August burned on. The house walls began to rise, solid and plumb, from the foundation they had laid together. Etta bought timber from the mill in Copper Creek with part of what remained of her $30, and Ezekiel contributed notching techniques and the kind of practical wisdom about load-bearing and mountain wind that only came from building in this terrain. Every morning, she arrived first. Every morning, he found her already at it. Every morning, he smiled. She had begun to think about that smile more than she wanted to. She was not a woman who had spent much time thinking about men. She had grown up in the practical world of farm work where sentiment was a luxury you could not always afford, and the men she had known had generally been either too dismissive or too eager in ways that amounted to the same disrespect. But Ezekiel Maddox was neither of those things. He was simply, completely, a person who took her seriously, and she was discovering that she had been so starved of that experience that the simple fact of it had begun to feel like something extraordinary. She also could not stop noticing how he looked. She was not pleased with herself about this. She had work to do. One morning in mid-August, she arrived at the parcel to find that a section of the irrigation channel she had been extending to reach the kitchen garden site had partially collapsed overnight, the soil undermined by a burrowing animal she had not known to look for. She was kneeling in the mud, her skirts soaked through, trying to assess the damage when Ezekiel arrived. He swung down from his horse and came to look at the damage, and she braced herself for the smile, because she was mud-soaked and clearly in difficulty, and she did not want his amusement right now. But he did not smile. He crouched beside her, elbows on his knees, studying the collapsed section with complete seriousness, and said, "Gopher, see the spoil mounds along the bank here. You need to pack the channel walls with flat stone along this stretch. Takes longer, but gophers cannot move through stone." "I did not know about the gophers," she said, irritated at herself. "Nobody knows about the gophers until the gophers show them," he said. He glanced at her, and there was nothing in his expression but practical solidarity. "Do you have the flat stones for it?" "Not yet," she admitted. "There is a good source at the creek bend below the second switchback," he said. "I can bring a sled load up this afternoon if you want to start the channel repair tomorrow." "I can get the stones myself," she said. "I did not say you could not," he said mildly. "I said I could bring them this afternoon, which means you can work on something else this afternoon instead of spending half a day doing fetch work." She opened her mouth to argue and then stopped, because he was right, and arguing with him when he was right was something she was trying to discipline herself out of. "Fine," she said. "Fine," he agreed and stood up, and then the smile came, brief and warm and private, and she turned back to the mud so he would not see what her face was doing. That afternoon, while he hauled stone, she worked on the window frames for the house, fitting the wooden pieces together with the careful precision that carpentry required and that she was better at than she had expected. Her father had taught her some of this too, in the winters when there was nothing to do outside but repair things inside. She was absorbed in the work, focused and quiet, when she heard Ezekiel set down the first load of stones behind her. "Those joints are clean," he said. She did not look up. "I know. Better than mine," he said, and she did look up then because she had not expected that. He was completely serious. He was looking at the window frame with genuine assessment. "My father was particular about carpentry," she said. "He taught you well," Ezekiel said simply, and went back for another load of stones. She held the window frame in her hands for a moment and felt something warm and complicated move through her that she declined to examine. September arrived and brought with it a sharpening of the air, a clarity and a bite that the August heat had not had, and the aspen trees on the slopes above began their slow gold transformation that turned the whole mountainside into something that looked like a painting by someone who had not been able to resist using too much color. Etta was making real, visible progress on the homestead. The house walls were up to window height. The root cellar was dug and framed. The kitchen garden site was cleared and ready for the cold season crops she would put in next spring. She had begun to feel the first flickers of something that might, in careful amounts, be called hope. She also owed Ezekiel Maddox somewhere in the vicinity of 200 hours of labor. She had been keeping meticulous track of this in a small notebook she carried, and the number had been bothering her for some time. She raised the subject one September morning while they were working on the roof framing, which was demanding and physically frightening, and which Ezekiel navigated with a complete absence of fear that she found both admirable and slightly irritating. "I have calculated what I owe you," she said, from her position on the wall top where she was steadying a beam while he hammered it into its notch from the opposite side. "You do not owe me anything," he said, without breaking his rhythm. "We agreed that I would compensate you in labor if I could not pay in cash," she said. "I am holding you to the agreement." He paused his hammer. He looked at her across the beam. What is the number? Based on honest wage for skilled labor in this territory and accounting for the stone hauling, the channel repair work, the fence advice, the foundation instruction, and the roof framing, I calculate I owe you approximately 47 days of work on your property. He was quiet for a moment. That seems high, he said. It is correct, she said, and you intend to pay it. I do, even if it takes you into next summer. Even if it takes me into the summer after that, she said, and held his gaze, and he looked at her with that particular quality of attention she had come to recognize as the thing he did when she surprised him, when she did or said something that recalibrated his understanding of her, and it was accompanied, as almost everything was now, by the smile. "All right, Miss Barrett," he said. "We will figure it out." That afternoon, after the work was done, she was washing the day's dust off her hands at the creek when he came to collect his horse, and she heard herself say, entirely unprompted, "My father would have liked this land." She was not sure why she said it. She had not meant to. It felt too close to something real. Ezekiel stopped. He looked at the creek, the mountains, the aspens that had gone fully gold now and were trembling in the evening breeze. "Tell me about him," he said. She had not talked about her father to anyone in months, not because she was not grieving, but because there had been no one to tell. She was surprised to find that she wanted to talk about it now here to this man who asked questions directly and listened the same way. She talked for a long time. About her father's hands, which were always cracked and stained with soil. About the way he could read weather in clouds while she was still learning to read letters. About his laughter, which was enormous and incongruous in a man so worn by work. About how he had died in April with the field still unplanted and the debt still full, and how she had stayed long enough to settle what could be settled and say goodbye to neighbors who had been kind, and then she had pointed herself toward the mountains because she had needed to be somewhere where the scale of things dwarfed the size of her grief. When she stopped, the creek was loud in the silence. "That is a good reason to come to the mountains," Ezekiel said. "It is not a practical reason," she said, trying to recover some of her habitual practicality. "The best reasons often are not," he said. He was looking at the water, and his profile in the low golden light was something she thought, privately, she would not forget. "I came up here because I could not breathe anywhere else," he said, and she understood precisely what he meant. October arrived with a force that reminded everyone in Copper Creek that the mountains held the final authority over all plans and intentions. The temperature dropped 20 degrees in 2 days, and there was a morning frost that turned the grass silver and made the mud in the work site crunch underfoot. Etta watched her breath cloud before her face as she rode up the trail in the dark of early morning, and she pushed her horse faster because she refused to give the mountain the satisfaction of arriving after Ezekiel. She never did arrive after him, not once in the entire season. He smiled every single time, but October also brought trouble. Etta arrived at the homestead one morning to find that the east-facing wall of her house had partially fallen, victim of the root rot in 2 of the lower-tier logs that she had not known to check for because she had not wintered a structure in mountain conditions before. She stood looking at the collapsed section and felt something that was dangerously close to despair. She did not let it show. She started pulling the damaged logs free. When Ezekiel arrived and saw the damage, his jaw tightened briefly and she could see him do rapid calculations in his head. "When did this happen?" he asked. "Sometime in the night," she said. "Probably when the frost contracted the wood." He walked around the collapse, examining the sound logs, pressing his thumbs into the wood to test for softness. "4 logs," he said. "The others are sound. We can resource the 4. The wall can be rebuilt." "I know it can be rebuilt," she said, with more edge than she intended. She was pulling a damaged log, and the physical work of it was helping her keep herself together. "I am not giving up." "I know you are not," he said, and his voice was so simply and completely certain of this that she had to stop for a moment and close her eyes and breathe. "We are running out of time before the first serious snow," she said, and her voice was careful and controlled, but just barely. "Yes," he said, but we have enough time if we do not waste any of it." He said it the way he said most things, factually and without drama, but the way he said we caught somewhere inside her chest and held on. They rebuilt the wall. He cut timber from his own woodlot, logs he had been seasoning for his own use but offered without any particular ceremony, just carried them over and set them in place. She worked beside him without stopping from first light to well after dark, and when the wall was solid again, she sat down on the cold ground against it and thought she might not ever stand up. He sat down too, a few feet away, his back against the wall. He handed her the canteen and she drank. "You are going to make it," he said after a while. "I am aware of that," she said, though she had not actually been certain of it 20 minutes ago. He said, and there was something different in his voice that made her look at him. He was looking at the dark tree line, the stars that had come out above the peaks in a thick, brilliant scatter. "I mean, you are really going to make it. This land is going to be something." She looked at what he was looking at. The homestead in the dark, incomplete but real, the stone foundation solid beneath them, the walls standing, the root cellar dug, the creek audible below in the silver night. "Why does that matter to you?" She asked, and she heard in her own voice that she was not asking it as a challenge. She was asking it for real. He was quiet for a moment. "Because I have watched you work for 3 months," he said. "I have never seen anything like it." She did not know what to say to that. "I get to the trail every morning before the sun," he continued, and his voice was careful now, like someone walking on ice and testing each step. "And you are always already there, already at work, already moving, every day, no matter what broke the day before." She felt her heart doing something entirely disobedient. "I am just doing what needs doing," she said. "No," he said again, and turned to look at her directly, and in the starlight his gray-green eyes were something she could not look away from. "You are doing more than that. You have been trying to outwork the mountain all season." "I have not been trying to outwork you," she said, though they both knew this was not entirely true. "I know," he said, and the smile came again. Even in the dark she could see it, and this time it was different from all the previous ones, warmer and more open, as if he had decided something. "But you tried to outwork me too, and it was the finest thing I have watched in my entire life." The silence that followed was the kind that had its own weight and texture. "Ezekiel," she said, and his name in her own voice sounded strange to her, intimate in a way she had been carefully avoiding. "Miss Barrett," he said, and then caught himself, and something in his face shifted. "Etta," he said instead, and it was the first time he had used her given name, and it did something to her that she had no adequate language for. "I do not do things halfway," she said, and she was not entirely sure what she meant by it, or rather she was entirely sure and was choosing her words carefully. "I know," he said. "Neither do I." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "I would like to have supper with you tomorrow evening, at your cabin, if that is all right." He looked at her as though she had rearranged the stars into a new configuration. "That would be more than all right," he said. She rode home in the dark with her heart loud in her ears, feeling ridiculous and alive in equal measure. Supper the next evening was simple: roasted venison and winter squash and bread that Ezekiel had made himself, which surprised her until she remembered that a man who lived alone in a mountain cabin needed to cook, or he would not eat. His cabin was as considered inside as out, not fussy, but deliberate. A solid pine table worn smooth by years of use, a stone fireplace that took up most of one wall and heated the whole structure efficiently, shelves of carefully organized supplies, a pair of books that she noticed with pleasure were not just practical almanacs but actual literature, a worn volume of Shakespeare and what appeared to be a natural history of the American West. "You read Shakespeare," she said, touching the spine. "My mother left it to me," he said, from the fireplace where he was attending to the food. "She was educated, she believed very strongly in it." "And you?" she asked. "I agree with her," he said. They ate at the table with the fire at their backs and the wind starting up outside, the first real autumn wind that had the flavor of winter in it, and they talked for 3 hours without once running out of things to say. She told him about the reading she had done as a girl, the stack of borrowed books she had worked through during the Kansas winters. He told her about the first winter he had spent in this cabin, alone at altitude in a blizzard that had lasted 10 days, and how he had spent it reading the Shakespeare and thinking about the people who had been caught in circumstances beyond their control and had survived them anyway or had not. "What do you want?" she asked at one point and then clarified, "Not from the land, from life. What do you actually want?" He looked at her across the table. The firelight was moving on his face, picking out the angles of his jaw and cheekbones and the particular quality of his eyes. He said, "What I have always wanted is someone to sit across this table who is worth talking to." She held very still. "And," she said, because there was clearly more. "And someone who is not going to look at this life and find it lacking," he said. "Someone who looks at it and sees what it actually is." She looked around the cabin. The honest, unadorned solidity of it. The fire and the wind and the mountains pressing their cold weight against the walls, the Shakespeare on the shelf, the supper on the table. Outside, somewhere in the dark, her homestead was rising, incomplete but real, stone and timber and effort, the work of her hands and his. "I do not find it lacking," she said quietly. "No," he said. "You do not." She should have ridden home. It was late and the trail was dark and the wind had teeth in it now. But she sat at that table for another hour, not because she had run out of things to say, but because she was reluctant to end something that felt like the beginning of a thing she had not known she was waiting for. When she finally said good night, he walked her out to her horse and held the stirrup while she mounted, and when she looked down at him in the dark, he was looking up at her with an expression that was open and serious and held not a single element of pretense. "Etta," he said. "Ezekiel," she said. "Come back tomorrow," he said. "I come every day," she said. "Yes," he said. "But come back tomorrow knowing that I am not just glad for the help on the homestead." She rode home through the dark mountain air with the stars pressing down from above, and the aspen's bare branches clicking in the wind and her heart doing something it had not done in a very long time, something reckless and certain, and entirely beyond her control. The work continued through October and into the first days of November with the focused urgency of people who understood exactly what they were racing. The house needed a door that fit properly, and a chimney that drew, and a floor laid before the deep cold set in. The root cellar needed its supplies. The small stable she had added to her plans needed at least a basic structure so her horse was not standing in open weather through the winter. These things happened because she and Ezekiel worked every available hour, side by side, without wasted motion or unnecessary conversation, but with a quality between them now that was different from what had existed in July, something that had weight and warmth and direction. There were moments. They accumulated the way rivers accumulate, from small sources into something substantial. There was the morning she slipped on ice-coated timber and he caught her before she hit the ground, one massive arm across her back, and held her upright, and neither of them said anything but she stayed, just for a breath, against the solid wall of his chest with her hand gripping his forearm, and the moment lasted slightly longer than pure practicality required. There was the afternoon she found him sitting on the unfinished floor of the house reading her supply ledger. Not in a prying way, but in the way of someone who was quietly doing the math for someone else and trying to figure out if the numbers added up for winter. She leaned in the doorway and watched him frown at the page and thought that this was the kindest thing anyone had done for her in a year. "The beans are going to be short," he said, without looking up. "I know," she said. "I have excess from my harvest," he said, "more than I need for one person." She did not argue. "I will compensate you in the spring," she said. "The spring is fine," he said, and looked up, and the look lasted 4 full seconds before she turned to go back to work, which was 2 seconds more than it needed to be, and both of them knew it. There was the evening it snowed for the first time, a dry, fine snow that came off the peaks and settled on the homestead in a thin white layer that changed the entire character of everything, making it clean and quiet and strange. She was standing in the doorway of the nearly finished house looking at it when she heard his horse on the trail. He had come back, though their work for the day was done. He came to stand beside her in the doorway, looking at the snow. "First snow," she said. "First snow," he agreed. "It is beautiful," she said. "Yes," he said, but he was looking at her when he said it, and she felt the color come into her face and was grateful for the low light. Turned to face him. They were very close in the narrow doorway. She could feel the warmth of him in the cold air. "I am not a woman who does things because it is expected of me," she said, which was not what she had planned to say but was true. "I know," he said. "So when I say something, I mean it," she said. "I believe you," he said, and his voice had gone quiet in a way that made the air between them feel pressurized. "I did not come to Wyoming looking for anything except a piece of land," she said. "No," he said. "But I have found something else," she said, and looked at him steadily. And this was the bravest thing she had done all season, braver than any of the work. "And I want to be honest about it because I do not know how to be otherwise." He reached up and brushed a loose strand of dark hair from her face with the back of 2 fingers, the gentlest gesture she had ever seen those big, work-roughened hands make. "Etta," he said, and there was everything in the way he said her name, tenderness and certainty, and something held carefully in check. "Yes," she said, though he had not asked a question, but she understood what he was telling her and she answered it. He kissed her then, there in the doorway of her nearly finished house with the first snow of the season falling around them and the mountains watching from above. And it was the kind of kiss that had been building for 4 months of side-by-side work and early mornings and accumulated moments, deliberate and warm and absolutely certain of itself. When they broke apart, the snow was still falling. The mountains were still there. Everything was exactly as it had been, except that everything was different. "I should tell you," he said, his voice slightly rough, his hands on either side of her face, "that I have been in love with you since approximately the 3rd morning you arrived before me and started laying stones without waiting for anyone's permission." She laughed, which surprised her, a real laugh that came from somewhere genuine. "I was trying to outwork you," she said. "I know you were," he said, and the smile appeared, the one she had been watching for 4 months, and she understood now, finally, what it had been saying all along. November came fully. The homestead was not perfect, but it was functional. The house stood solid on its stone foundation with its chimney drawing cleanly, and its door fitting squarely in its frame. The root cellar was stocked with enough provisions to see a person through the winter if they were careful. The small stable held her horse. It was not the finished, thriving farm she had envisioned, not yet, but it was real and it was hers, and it was built with the work of her own hands and the partnership of a man who had never once told her what she could not do. She moved into the house on the 1st of November, 1883. She lit the fireplace and sat at the small table she had built herself and looked at the 4 walls she had raised from the mountain ground and felt a satisfaction so deep and wordless that she did not try to put it into language. Ezekiel came the next morning to check on the chimney draw and to bring a load of firewood that she had not asked for but accepted without argument because the winter that was closing in around the peaks was clearly not going to negotiate. And because she understood now that accepting help from this man was not the same as needing to be saved. They fell into a rhythm over the winter months that was domestic in the best sense of the word, practical and warm and entirely chosen. He would ride over from his cabin most evenings, sometimes bringing food, sometimes simply arriving with his presence and the easy companionship of someone who had made a decision and was comfortable in it. She would cook, or he would cook, and they would eat at her table or his, and they would talk about the land and the weather and the plans for spring and the Shakespeare that she had started borrowing from his shelf. And sometimes they would sit in comfortable silence while the wind tore at the mountains outside and the fire held its ground. He was careful with her, not in the way of someone who thought her fragile, but in the way of someone who understood that she had arrived in this place carrying a specific kind of sorrow and a specific kind of pride, and who respected both of those things enough not to rush her. He was patient with a patience that was not the same as passivity. It was the patience of someone who had made up his mind and was not worried about the timeline. She appreciated it more than she could have said. In December, Harlan Briggs rode up from Copper Creek with the mail, and a knowing look on his face that told her the nature of her arrangement with Ezekiel Maddox had become a topic of conversation in town. She did not particularly care, but she asked Harlan directly what people were saying. "Nothing mean," he said, with the careful honesty of a man who has decided to be truthful. "Most folks think it makes sense. Ezekiel is well regarded up here. People were wondering when he was going to find someone worth his time." Harlan paused. "I think you are worth his time, Etta." "I think he is worth mine," she said, which was the most she intended to say on the subject to anyone but the man himself. She told Ezekiel about the conversation that evening. He was amused by it in an unhurried way. "Copper Creek is a small town," he said. "It has opinions." "Does it bother you?" she asked. He looked at her across the table. "Why would it bother me?" he said simply, and went back to his food, and she thought she loved him for that, among other things. It was in January, during a blizzard that locked them both in her cabin for 2 days while the Wind River Range demonstrated exactly what it was capable of, that she told him she loved him. It came out unprompted, in the middle of a conversation about spring planting, and she said it the same way she said most things, directly and without apology. He set down his fork. He looked at her for a moment with an expression that was undone in the best possible way, as though she had said the thing he had been hearing in every day of the last 6 months but had not expected her to put into words this soon. "Etta Barrett," he said, and stopped. "Yes," she said, watching him with the particular steadiness that was the thing she was known for. "I love you," he said. "I have loved you since July. I will love you for every year that comes after this one." The blizzard ran itself out over the next 12 hours, and the world it revealed when it was done was white and absolute and completely still. The mountains rising from the snow like creatures that had simply waited out the storm, because they had done this 1,000 times before and would do it 1,000 times more. She stood in her cabin doorway looking at it with his arm around her shoulders and felt the particular quality of a thing that was not just survived but arrived at, something that had required the whole journey to reach. "What happens in the spring?" he asked, and she knew he was not asking about the planting. She turned to look at him. He was looking at the mountains the way he always did, with that bedrock belonging, but his arm was warm and solid around her, and his expression when he turned to meet her eyes was something she had come to know as the most honest face of him. "What do you want to happen in the spring?" she asked, because she had decided months ago that she was going to let this man ask her what he wanted to ask her in his own time. "I want you to marry me," he said, without any of the awkwardness or performance she might have expected. He said it the way he said everything, directly and meaning every word. "I want to combine the two properties and build this into something real. I want to come home to you every evening, and I want your face to be the first thing I see in the morning." "You already see my face first thing in the morning," she said, "because I arrive before you." "Yes, you do," he said, and the smile came, wide and completely delighted now, the smile she had been watching since July all the way to its full expression, and she thought that it had been worth every early morning, every bleeding blister, every stone hauled from the creek bed, just to arrive here at this particular smile on this particular face. "Yes," she said. "Yes, you arrive before me," he said, though he knew what she meant. "Yes, I will marry you, Ezekiel Maddox," she said. "Yes to all of it." He pulled her against him in the cabin doorway with the snow blazing white outside and the mountains absolute above them, and held her with the same total certainty that he brought to everything, not possessive but present, not claiming but choosing. And she held him back with the same determination she had brought to every stone and every early morning, not yielding but arriving, not giving up but giving everything. They were married in Copper Creek in March of 1884, when the first thaw was beginning, and the creek was running high with snowmelt, and the aspens were showing the first faint green of coming leaves. The ceremony was held in the small church at the edge of town, the pews full of the people of Copper Creek who had opinions about everything, and had decided that this particular development was a good one. Harlan Briggs walked Etta down the aisle with his pipe tobacco smell and his genuine happiness, and Ezekiel waited at the front of the church in the one good shirt he owned, his hair combed back, his gray-green eyes finding her the moment she appeared in the doorway, and not leaving her face until she arrived beside him. She wore a dress she had sewn herself from fabric Harlan had ordered from Cheyenne, a deep blue wool that she had chosen because it was practical, and because it was the color of the mountain sky in October. She was not a woman who spent a great deal of time on ceremony, but she carried a small bunch of early spring wildflowers that Ezekiel had somehow found and left outside her cabin door that morning, and she held them against her chest and thought about what her father would have said about this day. He would have said good. He would have looked at Ezekiel Maddox and seen the kind of man he had always hoped his daughter would find, not one who wanted to take her over, but one who wanted to stand beside her. The vows were traditional, spoken by the circuit preacher who came through Copper Creek every 2 months, and when Etta said hers, she said them the way she did everything, with complete attention and full meaning, looking at Ezekiel without flinching. He said his with his deep voice steady and his eyes holding hers, and the church was very quiet. After, there was a supper in the church hall, and dancing to a fiddle played by the blacksmith's teenage son who was remarkably good at it. And Ezekiel danced with her twice, and she discovered that he was not a natural dancer, but that he made up for it with wholehearted effort, which seemed entirely consistent with everything she knew about him. Harlan cried a little into his handkerchief and pretended he had gotten sawdust in his eye, and several of the ranch wives who had watched the situation develop over the winter congratulated her with genuine warmth. They went home to the cabin that night, Ezekiel's cabin, which had become their cabin, because it was the larger and more established structure, and because the homestead needed another full season of work before it was ready to serve as a primary residence, though they had plans for it that they had been drawing out over the winter on paper by firelight. Plans that involved expanding the house, adding a proper barn, extending the irrigated fields, growing cattle alongside the homestead farming that Etta was already managing. She stood at the door of the cabin she had visited 100 times over the last 8 months and looked at it now with different eyes. "Needs a kitchen garden on this side," she said, looking at the south-facing slope beside the cabin door. "We can put one in this spring," he said, "and the paddock fence on the north side needs reinforcing before we expand the cattle," she said. "We can do that in April," he said. She turned to look at him. He was watching her with affectionate amusement and something deeper below it. "Are you going to inventory the property on your wedding night?" he asked. "I was just thinking about spring," she said. "Think about spring in the morning," he said, and held out his hand to her, and she took it, and they went inside. Spring came, and then summer, and the two properties worked by two people who had learned each other's rhythms over the course of a long, demanding season, became something genuinely productive and alive. They expanded the cattle operation, buying 6 additional head from a rancher in the lower valley who was selling off stock, and Etta turned the Creek Bend parcel into a working farm that produced enough to trade in Copper Creek and keep them more than comfortable through the following winter. They worked side by side, as they always had from early morning to late evening, and the joke between them, which was not entirely a joke, was that she still arrived first. She always arrived first. Even when they were living in the same cabin, she would be up before him, already dressed and boiling coffee, already making lists in her notebook of what needed doing, already looking out the window at the mountains with that particular focused attention she brought to everything. He would come into the kitchen still pulling on his shirt and find her at the table with her coffee and her lists, and he would stand in the doorway looking at her and smile. She would look up and say, "You are going to be late." He would say, "There is no such thing as late when you own the land." She would say, "There is such a thing as efficient." He would pour his coffee and come to sit across from her and look at her lists, and they would plan the day together, and it was, she thought on more than one morning, the best part of every day. By the fall of 1884, Etta was expecting their first child. She told him on an October morning, standing in the kitchen with the mountains visible through the window in their autumn coloring, and she told him directly, the way she told him everything, and watched his face. What his face did was remarkable. The contained, steady quality that was his usual expression dissolved entirely for a moment, just disappeared, and what was underneath it was something she had only seen in him in the most unguarded moments, a pure and uncomplicated joy that made him look younger and softer and entirely undone by happiness. He came around the table and took her hands and held them and looked at her with everything he was completely visible in his face. "Etta," he said. "I know," she said. "I am," he started and stopped and then said, "I cannot find the right word." "Good," she said. "It is a good thing." "It is the best thing," he said, and his voice had rough edges on it, and she stood up and put her arms around him and held on. Their son was born in June of 1885, a healthy, substantial boy who arrived with emphatic opinions about the world and a set of lungs that demonstrated he had inherited at least one of his mother's notable qualities. They named him Thomas, after Etta's father, and Thomas Barrett Maddox arrived at the Copper Creek homestead with the mountains watching and Ezekiel at Etta's side, never wavering through the long hours of labor, his hand in hers with a grip that she had to remind him once or twice to ease. He held his son for the first time in the early morning light with the look of a man who has been handed something of such irreplaceable value that he cannot quite determine how to hold it appropriately, and Etta watched from the bed, exhausted and proud and full of something she still did not have adequate language for. "He is enormous," Ezekiel said, which was not untrue. Thomas was a very large infant. "He is perfect," Etta said. "He is enormous and perfect," Ezekiel agreed and looked at his son and then looked at his wife, and the look that passed between them was the kind that does not require words. Thomas grew. The homestead grew. The combined Maddox operation, which Etta ran with the same systematic efficiency she had brought to everything since the first morning, she arrived with tools and plans, an absolute refusal to yield, became one of the more productive small operations in the Wind River foothills. They were not wealthy by any territorial standard, but they were deeply solvent, and the root cellars were never short, and the cattle were well managed, and the kitchen garden Etta had put in on the south-facing slope beside the cabin door produced in extraordinary quantities under her care. She expanded it twice. Copper Creek knew them as one of those couples that seem to make complete sense from the outside, in a way that is satisfying to observe. Two people who had chosen each other deliberately, and who wore their partnership visibly in the way they worked and argued and laughed and made decisions together. Harlan Briggs, who had by this time fully adopted the role of honorary uncle to young Thomas, told anyone who would listen that he had known from the first morning Etta walked into his store that she was going to make something of herself in this territory. He left out the part where he had been nervous about sending her up the mountain to negotiate with Ezekiel Maddox. That detail had become less important over time. The winter of 1885 was one of the harder ones in the territory, deep snow coming early and staying late, the kind of winter that tested the structures people had built and the preparations they had made. Ezekiel's roof held. Etta's root cellar held. The cattle shelter held. The baby was warm and well-fed and entirely indifferent to the severity of the weather outside, which is the particular superpower of well-provisioned infants. Etta spent the long, deep winter evenings reading, which she had missed during the working seasons when there was never enough light left for it, and Ezekiel read beside her, and Thomas slept between them on the bed with the uncomplicated assurance of a child who has never had reason to doubt that the world is a warm and solid place. By the spring of 1886, Etta was expecting again. This second pregnancy sat differently on her, easier in some ways and harder in others, the way the second time often mirrors the first while being entirely its own experience. She worked through it with characteristic stubbornness until Ezekiel, with uncharacteristic firmness and a great deal of love, told her in August that she was going to stop climbing into the hayloft and let him do it. She told him that he was overreacting. He said he was not overreacting. He was rationally assessing the situation. She said the situation was fine. He said if she climbed into the hayloft one more time he would stand at the bottom and hold the ladder and refuse to let her come down, which was not a threat that made any logical sense, but which communicated his feelings on the matter with sufficient clarity that she agreed to let him handle the hayloft. Their daughter was born in November of 1886. They named her Clara, and she arrived with a constitution of iron and a disposition of complete serenity, the opposite of her brother in nearly every measurable way, and the Maddox household adjusted itself to the addition with the organized practicality of a household that had learned to adapt. Thomas, at 18 months old, regarded his sister with a suspicious fascination that gradually resolved itself, over the course of several weeks, into proprietary affection. He was not yet 2 years old, but he was already demonstrably large, already demonstrably stubborn, and already, Etta noted with private amusement, learning to smile when things were not going his way, which she recognized from long experience as a Maddox trait. The years passed with the particular quality of years that are genuinely well-lived, not unmarked by difficulty or loss, but structured around something real and chosen. There were hard winters and dry summers, and the occasional disastrous season that required recalibration. There were disputes with a neighboring rancher over fence lines that required careful, persistent negotiation. There was the year a late frost killed half the kitchen garden, and Etta replanted in July, with a ferocity that had Ezekiel watching from the fence with that expression she knew so well, the one that was admiration barely contained by amusement. There were evenings on the cabin porch when the mountains turned every color known and some that were not, when Thomas and Clara ran in the meadow below, and Ezekiel sat beside her with his arm along the back of the chair she sat in, and neither of them needed to say anything because everything worth saying had been said and was being lived. He still smiled every morning. That had not changed. She would be up first, always first, already at the table with her coffee and her plans and her notebook, and he would come in from wherever he had gone to start the morning chores and find her there, and the smile would appear, the same quiet, genuine, completely certain smile that had been the most constant feature of her daily life since the summer of 1883. She had stopped pretending it did not affect her approximately 2 weeks after their first meeting. She would never tell him this. He knew. He had always known. One morning in the late summer of 1887, Ezekiel came in from the paddock while she was at the kitchen table with Thomas on her lap, going through the supply ledger and explaining the numbers to the 2-year-old, who was interested in the process for reasons that had less to do with accounting and more to do with the fact that he was allowed to touch the pencil. Clara was in a basket on the floor, sleeping with the absolute commitment of a very young infant. Ezekiel leaned in the doorway and looked at the three of them with an expression that Etta, glancing up, could only describe as a man who has been given everything he needed and knows it. "What?" she said. "Nothing," he said, and came in and kissed the top of her head and rumpled Thomas's hair and checked on Clara in the basket. "You have that look," she said. "What look?" he said, getting his coffee. "The look where you are very pleased about something and you are not going to tell me what it is." He sat across from her and looked at her over his coffee cup. "I am pleased about several things," he said. "The fence repair is done. The cattle are in good weight. My son appears to be learning accounting at an age when most children are learning to walk." "He is already walking," Etta said. "He is learning accounting." "Ambitious," Ezekiel said approvingly. "He gets it from somewhere," she said. He smiled. Thomas looked between his parents with the alert, slightly suspicious attention of a toddler who understands that something is happening that he does not have complete access to. Then he pointed at his father and said with great confidence, "Pa, that is correct," Ezekiel confirmed. Thomas pointed at his mother. "Ma." "Also correct," Etta said. Thomas pointed at the ledger. He had not yet developed the vocabulary for what he was pointing at. "Numbers," Etta supplied. Thomas repeated this with great satisfaction, as though the acquisition of the word had been the goal all along, and went back to touching the pencil. Etta looked at her husband across the table over the head of their son and thought, not for the first time and not for the last time, about the summer of 1883, about arriving at the Copper Creek stagecoach stop with her canvas bag and her $30 and her determination not to be someone people felt sorry for, about riding up the mountain trail for the first time and finding a man splitting wood with the efficiency of someone who did not waste motion, about deciding to work beside him instead of against him, and discovering that the line between those two things was different from what she had thought, about trying, every single morning, to outwork him, about arriving first at the parcel every day through the summer and the fall, through heat and cold and blister and wall collapse and the first snow, arriving with her tools and her plans and her absolute refusal to be beaten by the mountain or the work or the timeline, about looking up every morning and finding him arriving, finding him seeing her already at it, and finding on his face that quiet, certain, genuine smile that said she was the finest thing he had watched in his entire life. She had tried to outwork him all season, and he had smiled every single day she tried, and she had thought for a long time that his smile was about what she was doing, about the work and the determination and the stubbornness she showed up with every morning. It had taken her until the first snow to understand that his smile was about her, not about what she could do or how hard she worked or how early she arrived, about her. The whole of her, the determination and the grief and the laughter and the directness, and the way she held a window frame, and the way she asked real questions, and the way she looked at the mountains and found them worth everything they cost. "What are you thinking about?" Ezekiel asked, and she returned to the present, to the kitchen in the cabin in the Wind River foothills, to her son and her daughter and this man. "The summer we met," she said. "Good summer," he said. "The best summer," she agreed. "I disagree," he said, and looked at Thomas and at the basket on the floor and then back at her. "I think this one might be better." She looked at him for a long moment, and then she looked at her son and at her daughter, and out the window at the mountains that had been watching over all of it from the beginning, patient and enormous and entirely indifferent except for the fact that they were here, that this place had asked everything of her and given everything back, that she had arrived with $30 and grief and determination, and had built something that no bank could take and no frost could kill. "Yes," she said, "this one is better." He reached across the table and covered her hand with his, and she turned her hand over and held on, and Thomas put his small hand on top of theirs because he had decided he was included, and Clara slept in her basket, and the mountain stood above the cabin in the late summer light, and the creek ran fast and cold below the homestead, where the irrigation channel ran smooth and unobstructed alongside the kitchen garden she had expanded twice. And the access road Ezekiel had built was worn smooth now with years of use, and the lean-to on the eastern edge of the parcel had long since been demolished and replaced with a real building, a proper storage barn with a sound roof and stone foundation, built by two people who had started as reluctant partners and become something far better than that. That evening, after the children were asleep and the cabin was quiet and the fire had burned down to coals that gave off a steady, reliable warmth, Etta and Ezekiel sat on the porch together in the last of the daylight, the way they had gotten into the habit of doing in any season that allowed it. The mountains were doing what mountains do in the late evening, collecting shadows in their folds while their high peaks still held the fading gold of the sun, and the meadow below the cabin was purple-shadowed and still, and somewhere in the woodlot above the property, an owl was beginning its nighttime question. "Harlan told me today that the Miller homestead parcel just east of the lower meadow is up for filing," Ezekiel said. "I heard," she said. She had been to the general store that morning and Harlan had mentioned it with what she recognized as deliberate casualness. "What do you think?" he said. She was quiet for a moment, looking at the mountains. "I think we are not finished yet," she said. He turned to look at her with a smile that was wide and certain and completely unsurprised. "No," he said, "we are not." She looked back at the mountains, and then at the homestead below them, the fields and the barn and the garden and the fences, everything they had built from stone and timber and stubbornness and choice. From the first morning she had arrived before him, and the first evening he had smiled. From all the mornings that had followed and all the smiles that had followed, from the first snow and the blizzard and the vows in the Copper Creek church and the two small people sleeping inside the cabin. She was not finished with the mountains. The mountains were not finished with her. That was just fine. That was more than fine. That was everything she had come here for, and everything she had not known to look for, and everything in between. And the night came down over the Wind River Range in the summer of 1887, with the quiet assurance of something that has seen 100 years and intends to see 100 more. And Etta Barrett Maddox sat on her porch with her husband and let the darkness come, unafraid of it, the way a person is unafraid of a place that belongs to them and that they belong to entirely. All the way down to the bedrock, all the way up to the stars.